Hello everyone, my name is Jess Wagstrom and I am a professional dabbler. And today we are dabbling in knitting, specifically brioche stitch, and even more specifically brioche stitch while knitting continental, because that is how I knit. Tor Cooper watched my continental knitting tutorial and asked if I had a continental brioche tutorial. Before her comment, I had never actually tried brioche. So I dove into this stitch pretty deep to try and figure out what the heck is going on. So what the frig is brioche knitting? Brioche knitting is essentially a knit one, purl one rib pattern that's embellished with yarn overs and slipped stitches that create this really chunky fabric with this ribbed fishtail effect in between the knit stitches. The final product is pretty cool, but when you're working up the first few rows, it can look really confusing, and I was watching tutorials and very confused by it. I'm going to show you some exercises to get the basic concept down before we dive into the actual stitch. If you just want to skip ahead to the actual how to brioche part of the video, I'm going to put the timestamp here. Otherwise, feel free to follow along with the exercises so it all comes together at the end. Let's get learning, shall we? I recommend using an untextured yarn. The first time I tried this, I used one of my fancy hand-spun textured yarns, and boy oh boy could I not tell what was happening. So grab your solid color, untextured yarn, and cast on 20 stitches, however you prefer to cast on. You'll want an even number of stitches because brioche is worked knit one, purl one. And you'll also want to just go ahead and knit the first and last stitch and pretend they're not part of the pattern, because once we get the yarn overs involved, you'll want an extra stitch to kind of catch it in place so it doesn't fall off your needle. But for now, we're going to knit that first stitch, and then for the rest of the stitches, go ahead and work a knit one, purl one rib. This is not brioche stitch yet. This is just an exercise that we're gonna do to get you comfortable with some of the concepts. Remember to knit the last stitch. We're gonna flip it around, knit that first stitch, and you're gonna continue with your knit purl rib. After you've done about 3 or 4 rows in your knit one, purl one rib, I want you to start paying closer attention to what's going on while you're working the rib stitch. You'll see these V's, these stacked V's, and then you'll see kind of the lumps, little lumps here. The V's and the lumps, the V's and the lumps. So when you're going through and working your stitches, you're going to knit into the V's and purl into the lumps. And that is regardless of which side you're working. You'll notice that right now, this is a V stitch on this side, and if we flip it over, it's the lumps on this side, because a knit stitch is just a reverse of a purl stitch, right? Focus on just looking at your knitting. That is a knit stitch, I'm going to knit into it. That is a purl, I'm going to purl into it. That is a knit, I'm going to knit into it, purl into the lump, knit into the V, purl into the lump, knit into the V, and just keep going like this until you've established a sense of what to do. It's really beneficial to have a sense of whether you are knitting or purling just based on visual guidance rather than a pattern, because it's going to help you figure out where you left off, if you have a complicated pattern going on, and also when you have a confusing pattern like brioche, how to have a better sense of what you're doing even when the pattern hasn't developed yet. And now we're going to delve into the concept of slipping stitches. To practice slipping, we're going to go ahead and knit that very first stitch like we did last time. We are going to knit a stitch, and where we would purl, we're going to slip. Knit a stitch, slip a stitch. And what slipping a stitch means is we are just inserting the needle as if we were going to purl, and then removing the other needle, so we've just transferred the stitch onto the other needle. It's also important to note that we're doing it purl-wise, because if you do it knit-wise, you actually twist the stitch as it moves onto the needle. So it starts out with one leg in front and one leg in back, and moves to that back leg being in front and that front leg being in back. We don't want that to happen. We just want it to go straight across and keep the orientation of the legs and you do that by slipping it purlwise. Knit one stitch, slip one stitch, knit one stitch, slip one stitch, knit one stitch, slip one stitch, and so on all the way across, and then knit that very last stitch. Now flip your work around. You're going to knit that first stitch, and then you're going to go back starting with a knit and then a slip. A knit and a slip. Knit, slip. You'll see there's a little bar across the knit stitch, but if you move that out of the way, you should still be able to see the little V that indicates that you should knit into that stitch. But don't worry about that as much as knitting and slipping. So what's actually happening while you're doing this is your first go, you are knitting one stitch and then setting the second stitch aside for later. And then when you flip your work around, you're starting with a slipped stitch and you're going back through and knitting all of those. So you're knitting half of the row one way and then half of the row the other way. This is probably the most confusing part of brioche, so if it doesn't quite make sense, don't worry about it for now. Before we get too deep into that, we need to talk about yarn overs. You actually do a yarn over every time you take a knit stitch or a purl stitch. The way a stitch works is you insert your needle into the stitch, you yarn over the needle, and then pull the stitch through. Those are the steps that happen every time you take a stitch, even if you're going so quickly that they kind of all happen at once. So when a pattern tells you to yarn over, it just means that instead of inserting your needle first, you're bringing the yarn up and around the needle. You yarn over the same way, regardless of whether you are knitting or purling. And you yarn over by bringing your working yarn to the front and then wrapping it around the back of the needle. So yarn overs are pretty easy in brioche when you're knitting continental. You're just gonna bring the yarn to the front, wrap it around the needle towards the back, and then catch it with your index finger to make sure that it stays on the needle. And then you knit or purl your very next stitch as you normally would. So you establish whether or not you're knitting or purling on your first row. This first row we are going to brioche knit, so that means we're going to knit into our V's as normal and we're going to slip all of our purls on both sides. So when we go back and work the knits on the other side, we're actually working the purls that we slipped the previous row, whatever, here we go. So you're gonna knit that first stitch, get it out of the way, and now we have our established knit one, purl one pattern. You're going to knit just like normal, nothing's weird yet. But now we are going to yarn over and then slip that purl stitch. You've essentially created a stitch by yarning over and then slipped that purl stitch out of the way. And now I'm still kind of hanging on to my yarn over with my index finger on the opposite needle. I'm going to go ahead and knit the next stitch like normal, and you'll see that that kind of catches the yarn over in place. So now we've got this little yarn over, slipped purl pair. We're gonna go across the whole row like that. Yarn over, slip, and then knit to catch the yarn over. Yarn over, slip, knit, yarn over, slip, knit, yarn over. We're slipping only the purl stitches and we're knitting into the knit stitches. So if you're getting through this and you're not sure what to do next, is the next stitch a purl or is it a knit? Okay, I see that lump there, that's a purl, so I'm gonna yarn over and slip it. I see the V's here, so I'm just gonna knit it like normal. Go all the way to the end, yarn over, slip, knit, yarn over, slip, and you'll note this is our last pattern stitch, and this is why I had you add that knit stitch to the end, so you can knit it and lock that yarn over in place. Otherwise it would just fall off the needle. So now go ahead and turn your work and spread out your stitches, and you're going to see now that we've got these yarn overs on top of our knit stitches, and then the purl stitches hanging out by themselves in their little lump valleys. So then when we go back and knit the knit stitch, we're going to catch that yarn over with it, and that's going to lock that yarn over in place and create that fishtail effect that we see in the final brioche. So let's go crazy. We're gonna knit that first stitch. It's not part of the pattern. And now we are at our first knit stitch. So you're going to work this yarn over and this knit stitch as if they are the same stitch. You're going to knit two together. And since we're doing it in the context of brioche knitting, it is also a brioche knit stitch. And then on your purl stitches, you are going to yarn over and slip. Knit the yarn over and the knit stitch together, yarn over, slip your purl, knit the knit stitch and the yarn over together. Before we purl the next stitch, you can kind of see, if you pull it apart, how that caught yarn over has made one side on either side of the knit stitch of the fishtail, that little fishtail V. There's one side, there's the other side. The pattern isn't showing up yet. It's gonna just look like a jumbled cluster of yarn over and stitches. Just trust that it's gonna come out cool looking. So go ahead and work about 10 rows, and by that time, you'll be able to see the pattern start to emerge. So now I've done about 8 rows, and you can see that even though it only looks like about 4 rows of rib, I've really done 8. 1 on the front, and then 1 on the back. But because brioche creates such a thick and chunky fabric, it actually works up pretty quickly. So you can see that I've got this little fishtail in the valleys because I've caught this yarn over behind my knit stitches. And that's all there is to single color brioche knitting. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions whatsoever, please leave them in the comments. My name is Jess Wagstrom, professional dabbler. Today we were dabbling in knitting, but next video, who knows what it could be. I hope you're having a beautiful day, and I will see you the next time I make a video. Goodbye. But because brioche creates such a thick and chunky knit, blah, blah,